Now, when doing this assignment, it's important to remember, like the opposite of plus is minus, the opposite of times is divide, and the opposite of a square root is a second power. A square root and a second power are opposites. Okay, so when solving these equations, it says the square root of the number x, and then after the square root, plus 7 equals 16. If I squared a number x, add 7 to it, it equals 16. So I want to find out what this number is. There's only one solution because there's no power. You're going to use a power, but there's not a power to begin with in the equation. Okay, so what I want to do is ask myself a question. I'm going to look at the square root of x. Is there any number outside of the square root? Well, yeah, there's this plus 7, so I do the opposite, which is to minus 7. So I minus 7 minus 7. So 16 minus 7 is 9, so I have the square root of x equals 9. Now, to find the true value for x, we need to eliminate the square root from the equation, and the opposite of a square root is a second power. So I'm going to take this side to the second, and then the square root goes away, and then I have just x. But then I also need to put a second power on the 9. Okay, so 9 to the second power is 81. It's 9 times itself, so it's 81. Okay, and that makes sense, because if I have 81 here, if I take the square root of 81, that's 9, and then if I add 7, it equals 16, so that makes perfect sense. Okay, in the next problem, there's one answer, so I have the square root of 3x plus 8 equals 2. Okay, now the first thing I need to do is make sure the outside of the square root, I'm actually going to circle the square root, and the outside we have a plus 8, so I need to subtract 8. Subtract 8. Okay, 2 minus 8 is negative 6, so I have the square root of 3x equals negative 6. Now, before I can do anything about the 3, I need to get rid of the square root, okay? And to get rid of the square root, we take both sides of the equation to the second power. That cancels, and now I have just 3x, means 3 times the x variable. And then negative 6 to the second, now that's going to be negative 6 times negative 6, and that's positive 36. Okay? If you take a negative to the second power, it still ends up positive. Okay, now I just divide by the 3. 36 divided by 3 is 12. So x equals 12. Okay, the next problem, 5, and then we have the square root. By the way, this 5 in front of it means 5 times the square root of a number x plus 2 equals 30. So there's one answer. So I'm going to circle the square root, and outside I have a 5, but the 5 is multiplied by the square root. Well, what's the opposite of multiplication? It's division. So I need to divide by 5. And that goes away, and then divide by 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1, but having a multiplier 1 means you don't have a multiplier. Okay, so I have the square root of x plus 2 equals 6. And now that everything outside the square root has been cleared, I can now do my second power. So this cancels, and now I have just the expression x plus 2. And 6 to the second power, it just means 6 times 6, and that's 36. Okay, and then you can put a 1 in front of your x, and now you can get rid of your plus 2. So I had minus 2 from both sides, that would be 34. So 1x equals 34. And you can divide by 1 if you want, but it's still just 34. Okay, the next problem, 6, square root of x minus 3. So it means 6 times the square root of x minus 3. And then after the square root is ended, I have a 3 being added here, then equals 21. All right, so I'm going to circle the square root. Now, we have to clear all the numbers outside the square root. Well, I have 2 of them. I have a plus 3, and I have a 6 times. So we always want to undo the adding or subtracting first. So plus 3, I'm going to minus 3, and that's 18. Okay, so I have 6, and the dot, the square root of x minus 3 equals 18. Okay, now my square root is still not cleared because I have the 6 times out there. So I'm going to need to divide both sides of the equation by 6. So divide by 6, divide by 6. That is equal to 3. So now I have the square root of x minus 3. Okay, now my square root is clear. Now it is time to do the second power. So I second power, I second power. That cancels. And I have x minus 3, and then 3 to the second power, that means 3 times itself equals 9. Then I plus 3, and that's 12, so x is equal to 12. Okay, the next one, the square root of x, and then after the square root, we have minus 4 equals 10, so I'm going to circle the square root. And first I have to undo the minus 4, so I would add 4, and there's no multiplier in the front, so I don't have to divide here. So I have the square root of x, and then the equals, and then 10 plus 4 is 14. Okay, now my square root's been cleared, so now I can take this to the second power, and this will cancel. And then 14 to the second power, that means 14 times 14 is equal to 196. Okay. All right, next problem. 3 times, that means 3 times the square root of x plus 1 equals 15. All right, so I'm going to circle my square root, but I have this 3 as a multiplying number, so the opposite, what's the opposite of multiply? It's to divide, so we need to divide by 3 and divide by 3. So I have the square root of x plus 1, and then 15 divided by 3 is 5. Okay, now I don't have anything outside the square root, so I can now do the second power. So I go second power, and this cancels. I have x plus 1. And then 5 to the second power is 5 times 5, and that's 25. Okay, and then if x plus 1 equals 25, I'm guessing it's 24, so you minus 1, and x equals 24. Okay, the next one, 4 square root of x, and then minus 3 equals 9. So I circle just the square root portion of the problem, and I see, okay, what numbers do I have outside? Well, I have a 4 that is multiplied by the square root of x, and then 3 being subtracted. We want to take care of this first. Okay, some of you are like, well, does it matter the order you do it? Yeah, it does. You need to plus 3, and I have 4 times the square root of x equals 12. Okay, now I need to undo the multiplication of 4 by dividing by 4, and that'll be a 1, but having a 1 times anything means I don't need the 1 there. Then I divide by 4. So I have the square root of x equals 3. And now the square root's cleared, so now I can get rid of the square root with the second power, and that cancels. That's me just crossing out the square root in the second. And the other side to the second, that's going to give me just x, and then 3 to the second power, that means 3 times 3, and that is equal to 9. All these have just one answer, okay? The last example. 5, and then that means it's times. 5 times the square root of x plus 1 equals 20. So I circle the square root. Now I do have this 5. Now it's 5 times, so the opposite of times is to divide, the inverse operation. And I have the square root of x plus 1 equals 4. Okay, now that the square root is cleared, it is time to get rid of the square root from the equation, which we do by taking each side to the second. That gets rid of that. And I take my other side to the second. So it's going to be x plus 1, 4 to the second power. That means 4 times 4, and that's 16. So minus 1, and that's 15. All right, so what I'll have to say on that, remember to circle your square root and go from there. By the way, that's my square root, square root, square root, square root. And on the back side, here's a square root, here's a square root, here's a square root, and here's a square root.